It starts with footprints where there shouldn't be any. That's how this whole nightmare began. Cora Langley was up before the sun, like always. The air in the valley was still cool, still held the memory of the night. But when she walked out toward her father's corral, she stopped dead. There in the dried mud were tracks, 3 sets of them, deep, heavy boot prints, not wandering, not lost. They were deliberate, purposeful. Someone had stood there for a long, long time, just watching their house while they slept. And the tracks didn't come from the road. They came from the direction of the canyon, that jagged crack in the mountains her father called the Devil's Jaw. The ranch hands were all accounted for. No travelers had come through in weeks. This was their land, isolated, quiet. And yet, here was the proof. 3 men had stood just yards from their home, their intentions a complete mystery. Her father, Tobias, came out of the barn, his face a road map of worry lines etched by sun and time. He saw her crouch by the tracks and his whole body went stiff. "Leave those be, Cora." His voice was flat, empty. "But Papa, look, they're heading straight for the canyon." "I said, leave them." There was an edge in his voice she'd never heard before. Not anger. It was something colder. Fear. And that's when Cora noticed it. The way his eyes refused to look at the tracks. The way he wouldn't even glance toward the canyon, as if the very sight of it could summon something terrible. He told her it was dangerous in there. Loose rocks, rattlesnakes, hidden drops. He'd forbidden her from ever going near it her entire life. But staring at those 3 sets of boot prints, leading directly into the one place she was never allowed to go, a cold dread started to creep up her spine. Maybe the real danger in the canyon wasn't the terrain at all. Maybe the real danger was what someone had hidden there. By noon, her father was gone. He'd saddled his horse and ridden out to the southern pasture. But Cora knew it was an excuse. He just wanted to be away from the house, away from the questions in her eyes. That was his mistake. She saddled her mare, Dusty, her mind made up. The sun was hot and the tracks were already starting to fade. But she could still see them. 3 men walking with purpose, heading into the shadows of the Devil's Jaw. She followed them. The moment she entered the canyon, the temperature dropped. The high stone walls swallowed the sunlight, casting everything in a deep, perpetual twilight. The silence was absolute, so heavy it felt like a weight on her chest. Her father's warnings echoed in her head. Rattlesnakes, loose rocks. But the deeper she rode, the more she realized that was a lie. The main trail was well-worn, almost smooth. In places where the ground became steep, someone had carved crude steps into the earth or laid flat stones to make the passage easier. This wasn't an untouched wilderness. This was a highway. People came here. Often. Dusty snorted, her ears twitching nervously. Cora patted her neck, trying to soothe the horse and herself. They rounded a sharp bend, and the narrow passage opened into a wider, circular chamber, almost like a hidden courtyard carved by water and time. And what she saw there made her blood run cold. It was a campsite, and it wasn't old. A fire ring sat in the center, the ashes cold but still smelling faintly of burnt pine. 3 bedrolls were laid out in a neat triangle. Empty tin cans of beans and salted meat were stacked tidily against the rock wall. This wasn't a stop for weary travelers. This was a base, a hideout. She dismounted, her boots crunching on something scattered across the ground. Her heart leaped into her throat before she realized they were just animal bones. Rabbits, birds, the remains of dozens of meals. Someone had been living here, or at least visiting for long stretches at a time. She picked up one of the tin cans. The merchant's mark was stamped into the bottom, faded but clear. Whitmore's General Store, the same store in town where her father bought their supplies. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. These weren't strangers. They weren't drifters or outlaws passing through. They were neighbors, men she knew, men who tipped their hats to her on Sundays, who shared a drink with her father at the town saloon. They had been sneaking into this canyon, right on the edge of her family's land, meeting in secret. But why? What could possibly be worth all this trouble? Her eyes fell on a leather saddlebag, tucked away in the shadows near the bedrolls. It looked forgotten, left behind in a hurry. She hesitated for a moment, then walked over and unbuckled the straps. Inside, there was a folded-up piece of oilcloth. She pulled it out. It was heavy. She unfolded it on the ground. It wasn't a map. It wasn't a letter. It was a photograph. Faded, cracked, the faces ghostly and pale. A dozen men standing in a line, rifles held across their chests. They were standing right here, in this very chamber. She recognized some of them. Clyde Hargrove, their closest neighbor. Mr. Morrison, the town banker. And in the very center of the group, looking younger, harder, was her father, Tobias Langley. He wasn't smiling. None of them were. They looked like soldiers posing for a picture. Before a battle they knew they might not survive. What was this? A hunting club? A local militia? Then she saw the date printed at the bottom of the photograph. It was from 10 years ago. 10 years. He'd been coming here for a decade, lying to her, to everyone, about this place. Suddenly Dusty whinnied, a sharp, piercing sound of alarm. Cora spun around. The horse was staring back the way they came, ears pricked forward, muscles tense. And that's when she saw them. More boot prints, but these were different. They were fresh. So fresh the edges were still sharp in the soft earth near a small spring. Someone had come into the canyon after her. Someone was here, right now. A cold wave of terror washed over her. She grabbed the photograph, stuffed it back into the bag, and scrambled onto Dusty's back. She had to get out. Now. But as she spurred the mare toward the exit, she realized her mistake. The fresh tracks weren't on the path leading deeper into the canyon. They were circling around, cutting her off, blocking the only way out. She wasn't the hunter anymore. She was the prey, and the trap had just snapped shut. Panic is a cold, sharp thing. It cuts away all thought, leaving only the screaming need to run. Cora pulled Dusty back, deeper into the canyon's embrace, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Every clatter of a hoof on stone was like a gunshot in the oppressive silence. The canyon twisted and turned, a maze of stone and shadow. She took a side passage, hoping it might lead somewhere. Anywhere. But it was a dead end. She was trapped. She dismounted, pressing herself and the horse into the deepest shadows of a small alcove, praying they couldn't be seen. Her breath came in ragged, shallow gasps. Then she heard voices. They were coming from the main chamber she'd just left, muffled by the rock, but getting closer. Told you someone was here. The fire's been disturbed. That was Clyde Hargrove's voice, their neighbor, the man who'd brought her family a pie just last Christmas. The bag is gone, another voice said. Morrison, the banker, the one with the picture. A long silence. The air grew thick with unspoken menace. Find them, a third voice commanded. This one was cold, authoritative, a voice used to being obeyed. She recognized it with a sickening lurch of her stomach. Sheriff Whitmore. The law. They knew. They knew she had the photograph. They knew she'd found their secret place, and they were not going to let her leave. Cora squeezed her eyes shut, trying to think. Her father was in that picture. What did it mean? Was he one of them? The thought was a betrayal so deep it almost made her physically ill. The man who taught her right from wrong, the man who was her entire world. A criminal? She heard them splitting up, boots crunching on gravel, moving down the different passages, a methodical, terrifying search. They were checking every nook, every cranny. She was running out of time. Her eyes darted around the small alcove, desperate for an escape. The rock wall was solid, unyielding. There was no way out. Then she saw it, scratched into the stone, almost invisible in the dim light. A set of initials. MB, and below them, a date from 3 years ago. Her mind raced. Malachi Brooks, a rancher from the north end of the valley. He'd vanished 3 years back. Just disappeared. The sheriff said he'd probably just packed up and left his debts behind. Everyone accepted it. But here were his initials, in their secret meeting place. Below his were another set. RS 2 years ago. Robert Sterling. He died in a hunting accident. Fell into a ravine, or so the story went. JM 1 year ago. John Morrison, the banker's own cousin. He'd supposedly ridden off to California and was never heard from again. It wasn't a list of members. It was a list of the dead, a record of everyone who had been a part of this, whatever it was, and had been silenced. Permanently. Her blood turned to ice. This wasn't about secret meetings or drinking clubs. This was about murder. And then she saw the last set of initials. They were fresh. So new she could still see the pale dust from the carving clinging to the edges of the letters. T.L. Tobias Langley, her father's initials, with yesterday's date scratched right underneath them. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed from the canyon entrance. Not the searching steps of Hargrove or Morrison. This was a single rider, moving with a familiar, confident pace. A horse she knew. A rider she knew. Her father. He wasn't a victim. He hadn't been silenced. He had just joined them. "About time, Tobias." Hargrove's voice boomed through the canyon. "We've got a problem." Cora's world, which had been cracking all day, finally shattered into a million pieces. She pressed her back against the cold stone, the rough surface biting into her skin. Nausea rolled through her. Her father. Her papa. His voice drifted back, casual, completely unworried. "What kind of problem?" "Someone's been in here, found the campsite, took the old photograph." A pause. Cora held her breath, her entire being focused on his next words, praying for a sign, any sign, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. "A drifter, maybe?" her father suggested. "Tracks are from a single shod horse," Sheriff Whitmore cut in. "A small mare. Looks familiar." Another silence, this one longer, heavier. Cora could feel the weight of their suspicion, a physical pressure in the air. "Your daughter," Morrison said, his voice a low accusation. "She was looking at those tracks by your corral this morning. I saw her from my property line." The world stopped. The silence stretched for an eternity. When her father finally spoke, his voice was different. The warmth, the kindness, everything she had ever known and loved was gone. It had been replaced by something arctic, something utterly ruthless. "If Cora followed those tracks in here," he said slowly, "then we have a serious problem." "How serious?" Hargrove asked. "The kind," her father said, his voice dropping to a chilling whisper, "that requires a permanent solution." The words were like bullets. They struck her, one after another, stealing the air from her lungs. Her own father, her own flesh and blood, discussing her murder as calmly as he would discuss the price of cattle. She bit down on her knuckle, so hard she tasted the coppery tang of blood. A sob tried to tear its way out of her chest, but she choked it down, turning it into a silent, agonizing scream. This was a nightmare. She had to wake up. "Check every passage," her father commanded, his voice now filled with an urgency that terrified her. "Every crack. She knows this land. She's clever. Find her." Footsteps, coming from all directions, methodical, closing in. Her mare, Dusty, sensed her terror and let out a soft, nervous whinny. The sound was a death knell. "Over here!" Whitmore shouted from the entrance to her alcove. "Heard something!" It was over. They had her. She closed her eyes, preparing for the inevitable. Her father's face flashed in her mind. The man who taught her to ride, who read her stories, who promised he would always protect her. A liar. A monster. As Whitmore's heavy footsteps grew closer, her eyes opened and focused again on the carved initials on the wall. M.B. Sart M.T.L. But her gaze traveled higher. There was another set of initials, so old and weathered they were almost gone. She hadn't noticed them before. A.L. and a date from 20 years ago. Amelia Langley, her mother. Her father had always told her that her mother died of a fever when she was just a baby. He'd buried her in the churchyard, with a simple stone marker. He mourned her every single day. It was the foundational story of their lives, the tragedy that bound them together. And it was a lie. Her mother hadn't died of a fever. Her name was on the wall. She had been part of this, and she had been silenced. By whom? The question was so monstrous, Cora could barely form it in her mind. Who had carved her mother's initials on this wall of the dead? Whitmore was at the entrance now, his shadow falling over her. She could hear him drawing his pistol, but Cora wasn't thinking about Whitmore anymore. She was thinking about that photograph. Her father 10 years ago, looking hard and cold. 10 years after his wife supposedly died. 10 years after her initials were carved on this wall. He hadn't been mourning a dead wife. He had been replacing her. Thinking like prey gets you killed. Her father had taught her that on their first hunting trip. When you're cornered, you don't cower. You attack. Sheriff Whitmore stepped into the alcove, his pistol raised. His eyes hadn't adjusted to the deep shadow yet. For a split second, he couldn't see her. That was all the time she needed. Cora exploded from the darkness, not with a scream, but with a silent, desperate fury. She slammed her shoulder into his side, driving him off balance. The gun went off, the shot deafening in the confined space, the bullet ricocheting off the stone wall with a high-pitched whine. He was bigger, stronger, but she had surprise on her side. She kicked his knee, hard. He grunted in pain and stumbled. She didn't wait to see if he fell. She scrambled past him, out of the alcove, and ran. "She's here!" Whitmore roared behind her. "She's heading deeper in!" She could hear the others shouting, their footsteps pounding on the stone as they gave chase. There was no way out, but she couldn't stop. To stop was to die. She rounded a corner and saw it, a dark opening in the canyon wall she hadn't noticed before. An old abandoned mine shaft. A wooden sign, rotten and barely legible, hung over it. Danger, unstable. She didn't hesitate. She plunged into the blackness. The air was instantly cold, thick with the smell of damp earth and something metallic, like old blood. She fumbled in her pocket for the small box of matches she always carried. The first one scraped, flared, and died. The second one caught. In the flickering light, she saw she was in a narrow tunnel, supported by decaying wooden beams. A set of rusted tracks ran along the floor, disappearing into the oppressive darkness ahead. Behind her, she could hear them. They were at the entrance of the mine. "Don't be a fool, Tobias," Hargrove shouted. "That mine'll collapse if you breathe on it too hard." "She went in there," her father's voice replied, cold and determined. "We go in after her." Cora turned and ran, her small match providing just enough light to keep her from tripping on the rotten railway ties. The tunnel went on, sloping gently downward. The air grew colder, thinner. Her match went out. She was plunged into absolute, total darkness. The kind of black that feels like it's pressing in on you, suffocating you. She could hear them coming. Their footsteps were slow, cautious, but they were getting closer. They had lanterns. She could see the faint, ghostly bobbing of their lights far behind her. She kept moving, one hand on the damp, slimy wall, the other stretched out in front of her. Her foot caught on something, and she went down hard, her chin striking the iron rail. Pain exploded in her jaw. She felt around in the darkness. Her hand closed on what she tripped over. It was wooden, long and thin. A handle. She lit another match. It was a pickaxe, rusted but still solid. Lying beside it was a shovel, and next to the shovel was a pile of discarded, rotting clothes, and a human skull. The match trembled in her hand. It wasn't just one skull. As her eyes adjusted, she saw more bones, scattered among the rocks and debris. This wasn't just a mine, it was a dumping ground. These were the people from the wall. Malachi Brooks, Robert Sterling. This is where they put the bodies. A flicker of movement caught her eye. She raised the match higher. Carved into the rock wall, just like in the canyon, were more initials. Dozens of them. This was the real list. The full list. Spanning 20 years. And there near the bottom was A.L. Amelia Langley. But there was something else next to her mother's name. Something that wasn't next to any of the others. A single small handprint, carved deep into the stone. The handprint of a child. The light from their lanterns was getting brighter. Closer. She could hear them talking. "Should be right up ahead," Whitmore said. "She can't have gone far." Cora's mind was spinning. A child's handprint. Why? Who? She scrambled backward, away from the light, deeper into the mine. Her back hit a solid wall. Another dead end. But it wasn't a wall. It was a door. A heavy iron door, set right into the rock. It was rusted shut, a thick chain wrapped around the handle. She was trapped. This was it. She could see their silhouettes now, framed by the lantern light. 4 of them, her father in the lead. "Cora," he called out, his voice echoing strangely in the tunnel. "It's over. Come out. We can talk this through." Talk it through. The words were so absurd, a hysterical laugh bubbled up in her throat. "There's nowhere left to run," he said. He was right. She looked from their approaching figures to the iron door, then down at the pickaxe in her hand. If she was going to die in this tomb, she wasn't going to die alone. And she damn sure wasn't going to die without knowing what was behind that door. The chain was thick, rusted solid by decades of damp air. The lock was a chunk of corroded iron. "Cora, don't make this harder than it has to be," her father's voice echoed down the tunnel. It was closer now. Too close. She ignored him. She wedged the tip of the pickaxe between the chain and the door frame and put all her weight into it. The metal groaned in protest. A shower of rust flakes fell to the ground. "What's she doing?" Morrison's nervous voice. "Just give it up, girl," Hargrove yelled. "You're trapped." She pulled again, grunting with the effort. The old metal shrieked. One of the links stretched, warped. The sound was agonizingly loud in the narrow tunnel. "She's trying to open the vault," Whitmore said, a note of disbelief in his voice. The vault. So that's what this was. With a final, desperate heave, the chain link snapped. The broken ends whipped through the air, and the heavy chain fell to the ground with a deafening clang. The door was unlocked. Behind her, the footsteps quickened. They were running now. She grabbed the iron handle and pulled. It wouldn't budge. Rusted shut. She braced her feet against the railway tracks and pulled again, her muscles screaming. Slowly, agonizingly, with a sound like tearing rock, the iron door began to move. She opened it just wide enough to slip through and slammed it shut behind her. There was a heavy iron bar on the inside. She dropped it into the brackets. Safe, for now. She lit her last match. The room wasn't large. It was a natural cave that had been hollowed out and squared off, and it was filled with treasure. Not gold or silver, something far more valuable in this part of the country. Water. A natural spring bubbled up from the floor, clean and clear, forming a deep pool before draining away into a crack in the rock. This was the source of the canyon spring. They had controlled it. But that wasn't what made her gasp. Against the far wall, stacked in neat, careful rows, were wooden crates. Dozens of them. And they were stenciled with the same symbol. U.S. Army. She pried one open with the pickaxe. It was full of rifles packed in grease. Brand new Henry repeaters. Another crate held pistols. Another, boxes and boxes of ammunition. This wasn't just a cattle rustling operation. This was an arsenal. They were supplying someone, or they were planning a war. A massive boom echoed through the rock as someone slammed their body against the iron door. Then another. They were trying to break it down. Her eyes scanned the rest of the room. In the corner was a small crude desk. On it, a single thick leather-bound ledger. This was it. The real one. The master record. She opened it. The handwriting was neat, precise. Her father's. It detailed everything. Every rifle sold, every cattle drive, every bribe paid. It listed names of buyers in Kansas, politicians in the territorial capital, Army supply officers on their payroll. This was an empire of crime, stretching across 3 territories. The banging on the door was getting more frantic. A crack appeared near the hinge. She turned the page, and she found what she was looking for. The entries were 20 years old. Amelia. Becoming a liability. Asking too many questions. Wants to go to the marshals. The next entry was a week later. Problem solved. AL added to the mine list. Necessary sacrifice. The operation is safe. It was right there. In his own hand. He had murdered his wife, her mother, because she was going to expose him. The words swam before her eyes. The man who had raised her, who had held her when she cried, was a monster of unimaginable cruelty. The final entry on the page chilled her to the very bone. The child is a complication, but she looks like her mother. A useful tool, perhaps. She will be my reminder. My penance. He hadn't kept her out of love. He had kept her as a trophy, a reminder of the woman he'd killed to protect his secrets. Her entire life, her entire identity, was a lie built on the foundation of her mother's murder. A splintering crack echoed through the chamber as the iron door began to give way. She looked from the ledger to the crates of army rifles, from the rifles to the boxes of ammunition. Her father had taught her to hunt. He had taught her to shoot. He had taught her to survive. He had no idea how well she had learned his lessons. He hadn't raised a daughter. He had trained his own executioner. Cora worked with a cold, terrifying clarity. The grief, the rage, the betrayal, it all coalesced into a single point of pure, diamond-hard purpose. She loaded one of the new Henry rifles. The action was smooth, oiled. She filled her pockets with ammunition. The iron door groaned, the hinges tearing away from the rock. They were using a railway tie as a battering ram. It wouldn't hold for much longer. She looked around the vault. Her eyes landed on a stack of smaller crates in the corner, marked with a stark red warning. Danger, blasting powder. An idea, desperate and insane, began to form in her mind. She grabbed one of the lanterns they had dropped outside the vault. It was still lit. She found the fuses and blasting caps in a separate lead-lined box. She worked quickly, her hands steady. She placed charges at the base of the rock wall supporting the vault near the entrance. She ran a long fuse back toward the spring at the far end of the chamber. The iron door burst open with a screech of tortured metal. Her father stood there, silhouetted against the lantern light from the tunnel, his face a mask of grim determination. Hargrove, Morrison, and Whitmore fanned out behind him. "It's over, Cora," Tobias said, raising his pistol. "Give me the ledger." She stood at the back of the vault, the rifle held loosely in one hand, the ledger in the other. "You killed her," she said, her voice eerily calm. "You killed my mother." For the first time, a flicker of something crossed her father's face. Surprise, regret? It was gone before she could be sure. "She made her choice," he said, his voice flat. "She chose her conscience over her family. Don't make the same mistake." "My family?" Cora laughed, a bitter, broken sound. "You are not my family. You're just the man who murdered my mother and lied to me my entire life." She held up the ledger. "It's all in here, isn't it? Everything. Every crime. Every murder. All in your own hand." Whitmore took a step forward. "Give us the book, girl, and we might just let you walk away." Cora smiled, a chilling, humorless expression. "You know, Sheriff, I think I've heard that lie before." She tossed the ledger into the deep pool of the spring. It hit the water with a splash and sank instantly, the dark leather disappearing into the blackness. Morrison cried out in dismay. "The records! They're gone!" "It doesn't matter," her father said, his eyes locked on Cora. "She knows. That's enough." He raised his pistol, taking aim. "You're right," Cora said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It is enough." In one fluid motion, she raised the lantern and touched the flame to the end of the fuse. It sparked to life, a small, fizzing serpent of fire, racing across the stone floor toward the blasting powder. Her father's eyes widened in horror as he realized what she'd done. "Get out!" he screamed. "It's a trap!" But it was too late. Cora didn't run. She didn't hide. She dove, not away from the blast, but sideways into the deep, cold water of the spring. Just as the fuse reached the powder, the world erupted in fire and thunder. The explosion was immense, a contained, directional blast that ripped through the very heart of the mountain. The entire mine tunnel behind them collapsed in a cataclysmic avalanche of rock and earth. Her father, Whitmore, Hargrove, Morrison, they didn't stand a chance. They were buried alive, entombed forever with the bones of the men they had murdered. The shockwave hit the pool, a concussive force that slammed into Cora, driving the air from her lungs and sending her tumbling through the darkness. Her head struck something hard, and then nothing. She woke up floating. For a moment she thought she was dead. The silence was absolute. The darkness was complete. But she was cold. A deep, penetrating cold that spoke of life, not death. She was underwater. Her lungs screamed for air. She kicked, thrashing her way toward what she hoped was the surface. Her head broke through and she gasped, choking on air that tasted of dust and stone. The vault was gone. The explosion had collapsed the ceiling, but in doing so, it had opened a new path. The spring water, now a raging torrent, was pouring through a massive crack in the back wall, a new tunnel carved by the blast. She was being pulled by the current, dragged through a churning, subterranean river. She fought to keep her head above water, her body battered by the rocks as she was swept along through the darkness. It felt like hours. She lost all sense of time, her world reduced to cold water, sharp rocks, and the desperate, burning need for air. Just when she thought her strength was gone, that she would finally slip beneath the surface and let the darkness take her, she saw it. A faint, gray light ahead. The current grew stronger, faster, pulling her toward the light. She was shot out of the rock face like a cork from a bottle, landing in a wide, calm river under the pale light of a dawning sky. She dragged herself onto the muddy bank, shaking, bruised, and gasping for breath. She had no idea where she was. She had been spit out of the other side of the mountain. As the sun began to rise, illuminating the valley before her, she saw buildings. A town, not her town, one she'd never seen before. And she saw something else. Men on horseback riding hard toward her. They wore the uniforms of the U.S. Marshals. The explosion hadn't just been a sound. It had been an earthquake. It had shaken the entire region, bringing the law to investigate. She stood up, her clothes torn, her body a canvas of bruises. She was alive. She had survived. A marshal reined in his horse in front of her. "Ma'am, are you all right? What in God's name happened up there?" Cora looked back at the mountain, a silent, monolithic tombstone for the men who had built an empire of secrets within it. "Justice," she said, her voice hoarse. Justice happened. 6 months later, the story was the talk of the territory. The Langley Canyon incident, they called it. Federal investigators, guided by Cora's testimony, had spent months excavating the collapsed mine. They found it all. The bodies, the arsenal of stolen Army rifles, the sealed vault, and at the bottom of the spring, protected by the water and the sheer weight of the rock above, they found the ledger. The truth, it turned out, was harder to kill than the men who tried to bury it. The book exposed a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of the territorial government. Dozens of men were arrested, prominent businessmen, politicians, lawmen. The empire Tobias Langley had built on the bones of his victims came crashing down. The town she grew up in became a ghost town, hollowed out by the rot that had festered beneath its surface for so long. Cora never went back. There was nothing for her there but ghosts. She used the reward money offered by the federal government for the capture of the ringleaders to buy a small plot of land in California, as far away as she could get. A place with an ocean, a place where there were no dark canyons filled with secrets. Sometimes at night, she still dreams of the footprints in the mud, of the cold silence in the devil's jaw, of the initials carved on the wall. She dreams of her father's face in the lantern light, the moment he chose his secrets over his daughter. But then she wakes up. She sees the sun rising over the Pacific, and she remembers. Some secrets are meant to stay buried, but some truths, no matter how deep you hide them, will always find their way to the light. If you were on the edge of your seat through Cora's story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because you won't want to miss the dark tales we have coming next. And if you have a story about a family secret that turned out to be something truly terrifying, share it in the comments below. You never know whose life you might change by speaking the truth. Thanks for watching.